See that so many of you made it back to our next talk about water. Speaking of, 2 days ago, we asked you on LinkedIn how many people are estimated to live in severely water scarce areas by 2050. Right answer was 3 billion people, and the majority of you checked the right box. Thanks to all for participating. So now we're coming back to round 2 of our talk. This time, you have the opportunity to write questions in the chat if you want to know more from our next generation of leaders or want to comment on the discussion. Having said this, please join me now in welcoming Lindsay Marie Blodgett, former president of the World Youth Parliament for Water. Great to have you here. And Marie-Claire Graf, co-founder and advisor of the Sustainability Week for Business and Youngo Focal Point from the Global North. Moreover, I'm very happy that Matthias Berninger is willing to meet the challenge of answering the questions that the young generation might pose to business representatives. He joined Bayer in 2019 and is the Senior Vice President for Public Affairs, Science and Sustainability. Matthias is the architect of the Bayer's Global Sustainability Initiative, also focusing on the conservation of water and following the corporate vision, health for all, hunger for none. And now let's get right into the discussion. Matthias, how do you personally rate the importance of water-related risks in today's world?
For me, it's the most important topic we need to pay attention to. And there are lots of topics, but it really rose to the top for me. And I have to say, I'm a bit a latecomer to the water debate, in the sense that in my career, being as a politician or in business, I prioritized other topics, from deforestation to, of course, decarbonization. But the more I looked at what role water plays, the more I moved from like more water blind to water aware, to a person that basically says, look, this is the most important thing we need to tackle. And that's also why I joined this group of water and climate leaders. I was very happy to be invited. And then we work in the agricultural sector, and the agricultural sector is on course to consume about 80% of this precious resource of fresh water. So food and water are linked in ways that most people, I think, don't realize.
Lindsay, you belong, and I just introduced you, you belong to the World Youth Parliament for Water. You're the former president, but of course still representative. Please tell us a little bit more what you are doing there and what has made you join the initiative.
Thank you. So the World Youth Parliament for Water, it's a network of youth and young professionals that act for water. We're organized on the national level as well as the regional. And really, it's just a place for young people to collaborate, to find ideas. We also do a lot of advocacy work. And as we know, as much as water is a global issue, it's very local. So to kind of collaborate, to push youth, encourage and empower them on some of the local issues. Right now, I act as more of an advisor role for the organization, planning for the next 3 years, and also working as an independent consultant, advising governments, corporations on how to better engage youth on the long term, to think strategically. I think with the water and climate movement, we've seen a lot of traction, especially with Fridays for Future. And it's definitely great to see the traction of youth being brought to the forefront. I'm very grateful for the WMO to invite me as a panelist member of the Water and Climate Coalition. I think that's another great step. But my role is to help corporations, governments to think of long-term strategy for youth engagement as we are the next leaders. So thank you.
It's great to see that you're really already taking action, and there's future leaders are already on your path. Marie-Claire, similar question out to you. You are with, as I just mentioned, with Youngo Focal Point from the Global North, which is a youth organization of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. On what projects are you currently working with regards to water and climate change?
Yeah, thanks so much for giving me the floor. Probably most people ask themselves, okay, what is YOUNGO standing for? Actually, it's very easy, but at the UN, we love acronyms. So it's a combination of youth NGOs, and basically how the UN climate change is setting up, that the UN is a governmental driven process, so only the governments can take decision. Nevertheless, when it was back in 1992, I was not on the planet back then, when it was created, they already realized that the challenge ahead cannot be solved by the governments alone. That's why they came up with stakeholder groups. And one of them is children and youth, and that's what YOUNGO is doing. So it's a global network. It's a mechanism of ensuring that youth voices are heard in the climate negotiations. You're probably all aware that the next climate conference is hopefully going to happen in Glasgow in the UK, the COP26. And we just had 3 weeks of virtual negotiations. And this is what we're doing. So we ensure that the youth voices are heard where they need to be heard in the negotiations directly. And as there is not a specific negotiating item on oceans, what we're trying to do is to bring wherever needed. For example, when we talk about technology, when we talk about nature-based solutions, when we are talking about education, that we bring this element of water, when we bring also, for example, the Arctic, which is also part of water, when we are bringing in the frozen world, the cryosphere, when we're bringing in wetlands, that we ensure that water is a cross-cutting theme in the negotiation. Because I actually personally think that something like water shouldn't be like put in a silo and somewhere, and then the negotiators talking about water are there and the rest doesn't even care about it. And I think young people have been always, together with research and many other stakeholders, kind of on the pulse to push for this topic, because we do not see how we can overcome the climate crisis without young people and with really taking care of the oceans, because the oceans together with the forests and the soil are going to be our biggest allies to find the climate crisis. But also we have to ensure that we protect them. That's why we are organizing, for example, the Conference of Youth, as you can also see here in my background. It's the most substantial and biggest global conference for young people, and the outcome is directly feeding into climate negotiations.
Thank you. Very impressive what the two of you are doing all together. Matthias, I'm pretty sure you're just impressed as I am, even though I have to say you once were one of the youngest MPs in the German parliament at your time. But now we are both probably part of the boomer generation. So how can we include the views of the youth when defining targets for sustainable development?
First of all, whether or not business is doing that, you can see the legal system being a step ahead. So when you look at the recent verdict concerning climate change that took place in Holland, where Shell was asked to come up with more ambitious carbon reduction targets, or you see the highest court in Germany basically agreeing with the point of view of a group of very young people who said, look, guys, you can't kind of continue doing business in the way you do it at the expense of the next generation. It's no longer the question whether or not we're going to embrace. It's much more the question whether we really open our both hearts and minds to what's going on here. And I think that's the big shift that really is happening. When it comes to Bayer, and I've seen that in other companies as well, those who join the company who are just leaving university or young professionals, they have no time for blah, blah. They want sustainability at the heart of the business strategy. And that is something I sense in many companies, and that's a good thing. But as I said, the voice of the youth, for those who don't want to listen to it, will be made heard by the courts and also through other means. And I feel that's progress because it increases the dynamic. Speaking of 1992, Marie-Claire, I actually was part of this initial process in Rio. So I, in many ways, could not imagine that like a generation later, the situation is as bad as it is. Actually, I thought it was a problem my kids have to deal with. But the reality is that the impact of climate change is hitting even the older generation in their lifetime. It's not a surprise that, for example, heat waves are as much a problem for health of elderly people as in many countries COVID. Yeah? So something really big is happening at the moment.
still, hearing the youth, we really would love to get your input, who are all participating in this live talk as well. So punch in your questions in the chat, and then we make sure that we can ask them to our panelists. Lindsay and Marie-Claire, one question to you both. After hearing the previous discussion among today's leaders, what are your expectations for their future actions? Maybe Lindsay, you start.
Sure. One of my expectations, even as a panel member, is we talk about so many different water issues. President Adair specifically brought up how there's about 60 to 70% of water that's being lost just because of infrastructure. That's one. And then on the other part of the world, there's insecurity, so not enough water. So my expectation actually as a panel member is to let's decide on a few of these issues, and then how do we talk to corporations, governments, and push for these issues? Because I think if we just talk about all of the issues, there won't be some concrete action. So my expectation, even for this group, is to identify what those are and how do we take the next practical solutions, not to use a term, but concrete actions, buzzword. And a second expectation is how can we is that we're cross-collaborating. I'm actually at a food security workshop in Rome right now, and I'm usually talking to water people, but I think it's really important that we individually even step outside of our comfort zone, talk to the energy people, water. There's even people at this summit that I'm now that is in sports and culinary. And so I love it because it's a cross collaboration, and our goal here at this summit that I'm at is to find a commonality, like what are the things that we can agree on and work together for. But if we just show up in our own bubble, we're not going to really challenge our thinking. So that would be another expectation, if you will. And another reason why I'm so excited Matthias is on this panel, because it's pharmaceuticals, it's that corporation side. So that's an interesting draw for me as well.
Interesting. Marie-Claire, your expectations?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot about data, and I, of course, would never object that data is very, very crucial, but I think we have to ensure that we are not striving to get all the data and have a perfect map before we start acting, right? Because we could have maybe done this if, Matthias, when you have been at the conference, if we would have started 30 years ago, but now it's too late. I mean, science is telling us we have 8 years, right? So we should never strive for 100% data coverage and know exactly what we need. And I think we have enough data and we have enough lived experience to be able to know what we have to do. And also, I think it's very important to harness, for example, the local and indigenous knowledge around this, and this must not be done in a digital data-driven way, right? One can also talk to them and seek their knowledge, and we're trying to do this, unfortunately, because they do not belong to a government which is represented also in the United Nations or can have their own legislation. It's very hard actually to bring across this knowledge, and especially when it comes to water, when it comes to ecosystem restoration or preservation, it's very, very crucial to take this view in consideration. So this was a point which was, I think, missing in the beginning, and I hope that our leaders are more aware of exactly talking also to these people who are marginalized and who haven't been part of the discussion for too long, and but they really need to be part of this discussion. And yeah, I mean, my second point also, what Lindsay mentioned, right? I mean, we really have to stop pointing the fingers, okay, let the corporate should do this, the country should do this. I mean, honestly, we can do this for another 8 years, and then we all know it's definitely too late. Or we are starting everyone of their very intrinsic motivation. And we are not waiting until the government puts the regulation that Bayer needs to do X, and we are not waiting that Bayer is doing whatever that the government is moving ahead. It should be our very intrinsic and very human motivation to save our only home. And I think this is what is missing to me when we are saying, okay, well, the others are not doing it, so let's also not do it, or just give some lip service or give some declaration and give some young people here and there the spot to talk and then take the decisions exactly going in the opposite direction. So I really look forward to this very intrinsic motivation, also what you mentioned, Matthias, really having the heart in it, because otherwise I really do not see how this is going to work.
Matthias, how do you react to those expectations?
Yeah, my favorite SDG is number 17, because in of course UN speak, SDG 17 tried to kind of put in words what needs to happen, and that is uncommon collaboration. And what I like about WMO's initiative, bringing a very diverse group of people together, is it kind of embodies this idea that there are really not hierarchies or certain power streams that should determine, but really a group of people that says, look, we've got to find a shortcut here. We can't do the finger pointing. We can't poke holes in data because that gives us a few more years to basically avoid investing in new things. We have to act now. And Lindsay, what you're working on in Rome at the moment, that's really worrying. I mean, the FAO a few weeks ago published that the food prices for food crossing borders increased by 12%, and for the poorest country by 20%. And that is in part because there are droughts that force countries, be it extremely suffering countries like Syria, to import more food. And every time that happens, we don't have the money to invest in education and rural infrastructure and electrification or in basic sanitary infrastructures. Many people around the world still don't have them, even though in Johannesburg, everybody was like agreeing with the WASH initiative we get there. We have to speed things up. And that's only possible if we do it in a very uncommon way. And I hope that especially the business community wakes up to this as well. The good news is one of the largest investors, BlackRock, has come around and takes climate change seriously because they have looked systematically as to how the water crisis affects their investments. And what they saw wasn't pretty. And that really drove a decision in one of the most powerful financial engines around the world.
Do you both agree with what Matthias just said, Marie? You need to unmute yourself, Marie.
Good. I mean, I completely agree what you mentioned, Matthias, and I think Goal 17 is absolutely crucial to do this. I probably have a little bit more, how can I form this now positively? But so for example, in the investment also, like I think yesterday or the day before, a report came out that so many of the green investments are actually not green, and they're still going into coal, still going to fossil fuels, still harming human rights, are still open to child labor and so on. So I think we need there a way more like detailed view and also be way more critical. I think we are still like too loose and like, okay, if it's under 20%, let's go and invest in coal. Like this needs to stop, right? And this is when we're aiming for net zero, we have to stop all of this. It's not a little bit, 20% is not enough. We have to go to zero. And I was honestly really shocked that so much of the investment is still going into the past economy and it's not shifting to the new economy system. So I really hope that your vision is coming through, but we need to accelerate because the time frame is so tight, right? That's the problem. If we have 100 years, that's fine. We can do a slow transition. But if we have 8 years left, and for many ecosystems, for many people, it's already right now too late. You mentioned this with the heat waves, also for people, for example, here in Switzerland, it's too late, right? They died, for example, in the heat waves. We have statistical numbers, how many additional older people died in this heat wave. So it's like it's kind of a call for more urgency and also more very, very critical view on the common practices.
Yeah, and just to comment, Matthias pointing out that the 12% increase of price of food in other countries, I think that's a perfect example of how water risks in a certain part of the world impact different systems in another part of the world. And so I think that just gives a greater focus onto the risk of water. If it's not met, then it'll impact and continue to impact other areas in other parts of the world. Just it goes to that quote that we love to say, if climate change was the shark, water would be the teeth. It's a prime example.
And we have, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Marie-Claire. We have one question from Prakash Lama, maybe one for Matthias. Aside from including youth in this discussion, what is the organizers' plan in youth inclusion in the Water and Climate Initiative?
I think it's I think about two things. Yeah, we have to bring in different stakeholders, both at the dimension of like generational perspective, but also and that's something the organizers have done really well. We need to have a global lineup. It's always difficult when you're in one time zone to kind of completely reflect a global lineup, even leveraging technology. But to bring the perspective of people who are basically at the forefront of the water crisis, and to not talk about those people, but to listen to their stories is one of the very important parts of this. And that is something that is going to happen. A country like Tajikistan, for example, plays a very important role in organizing the UN World Water Conference in 2023. And they are doing that because they are at the forefront of the water crisis. And they are only reflective of some few countries. I mean, even in Germany, when you talk to people, for example, forest owners in Germany, they are experiencing the water crisis in ways they would have never expected. Yeah, so those people need to have the say in those conversations, or later they get to have a say when they sue those governments, municipalities, or businesses for not having been active. And I'd much rather solve the problem than bicker about the consequences of it.
Maybe a question out to the three of you, because we had some questions from the participants who want to know what is the most relevant problem for water. Is it climate change? Is it deforestation? Is it pollution? Is it plastic waste? Is it probably all of the above? Any thoughts on that?
Well, my very quick answer, it's all of them, because we cannot have one or the other, right? If the ocean is polluted, if the ocean is dying because of chemicals or plastic, it really doesn't matter. It's not going to work as a sink, for example, for carbon. And with this, you have a huge disaster when it comes to climate crisis. But the other way around, if you have more CO2 in the air, the ocean gets more acidic. The poles are melting, which also then leads to deaf areas, leads to like a change in streams of the ocean. So I think also we really have to get out of this one problem, one solution thinking, because it's how we got ourselves into this mess, thinking that there are quick fixes, there are like one-way solutions, and this is just not the case. And I really think that's why it's important to have these collaborations, and also, as Matthias before mentioned, these radical collaborations, new stakeholders coming together to solve these issues. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very challenging and not be able to make it in time.
And I'll add to that, Thomas. As much as it is a global issue, I think also breaking those pieces down and understanding what the problem is at your own region or your own state or your own country is also very important. That we know not only where our water comes from, but what are the factors that are contributing. Is it plastic pollution in your area? Is it, in the US, we have a big issue with PFAS or infrastructure, needing about like $420 billion to redo the infrastructure. So what are the local issues, and breaking it down from there? Because I find it being quite daunting to think about all of these insecurities, but like once you break it down and think about on the smaller local level, I think that's where we really have impact and we apply ourselves to those solutions.
Lindsay, you mentioned concrete actions, and Matthias talked about not doing so much blah blah. Now you have the chance, of course, because Matthias and I are working for a global corp, and then you can share with us how you think businesses can contribute to water protection, fighting climate change, and sustainable development in general, without any blah blah, but concrete actions. What do you want us and other companies to do concrete? And then Marie-Claire, you can of course join in.
Yeah, I use that buzzword, concrete actions, because it comes up a lot. But one of the things that I would love to see more corporations and companies is to have some type of water risk specialist or climate change specialist. I've heard of certain companies starting to really focus on it, like H&M. I think that's really interesting that they're starting to, if not for the past couple of years, like starting to think about how they're using water in their production line. And my expectation is that companies and corporations would follow a similar suit. There's been a lot of greenwashing lately where companies are selling their product saying that it's eco-friendly. Like I saw a piece of plastic the other day, like a plastic container, and it said like made from plants, but it didn't look any different than every other plastic container that just gets thrown in the waste bin. So I think it's really important that companies start thinking from the inside, but rather than only wanting to meet an expectations of the people, but that they're really starting to think on the inside, how are they changing their supply line? What are ways that they can invest if they're not, if they don't have a certain expertise? What are ways that they can invest into other ideas or projects that are in their local community that impacts the water, that will also in turn impact their product and the quality of the product?
Marie-Claire.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I mentioned before, that it really needs to be an intrinsic motivation. This needs to come with, for many, many companies, a change of business model, because the business model of the past and of the present has been based on extraction, seeing nature as a dump. Of course, no one is saying this publicly, but this is reality, right? Seeing the atmosphere as a dump for CO2, seeing the water as a dump for everything what is liquid, and seeing the soil as everything what can just be disposed and covered. I mean, where I live, Basel, we still have today huge issues from the pharmaceutical and chemistry company, what has just been buried underground. And what we see now is that more and more companies are waking up, and they put some SDGs they also like hire some sustainability specialists. Very often it's like a specific department. Very often they do not really have the power except doing a sustainability report, which they like maybe can present, maybe they cannot present it. But very, very often the companies, not often the companies are talking about these fundamental changes they actually need to do, because just tracking the CO2 emissions, scope 1, 2, 3, is not going to be enough to overcome the challenges we're having, right? And also to make a business attractive for young people who are purpose-driven. We need purpose-driven companies. And this goes, again, beyond like a statement like, we want to save the world, we want to have secure water, we want to give vaccines to everyone. There needs to be a strategy I can fully stand behind, and most companies are not yet there. They're on a journey. But also I think that it's very crucial that these changes cannot be done by the same people who haven't been doing it the last 30 years. And I quickly checked before the panel, for example, the management board or the board of directors from Bayer. And then there are 6 people, 5 of them are male, coming from a Western, or at least like how they look like, from a Western country. None of them is openly embracing the LGBTQI community. I mean, I see that that Bayer changed the logo. None of them is youth. I do assume that some of them have children. I do not know what the influence of the kids are on them. This is sometimes very, very influential. Nevertheless, none of them is youth. One of them is a woman. And I think to really make these changes happen, we need to have not only an intergenerational approach, like giving the trust to a young person, a really young person, to sitting there and shaping your company with you, but also giving the trust, for example, to a local indigenous person from the global south who has experienced this water insecurity or having experienced other issues. But I do not believe that we can do it with the same. And Matthias, you mentioned before the radical collaborations. But if we really embrace these radical collaborations, then we have to change the practice as it is. And also work with the employees together that they embrace the same. If we just do a sustainability statement or we change the logo, this is of course nice. But if the employees and the community within the company, or if the board of directors or the CEOs and all the other C-level people do not live this and do not really publicly and openly show this, it goes into not only greenwashing, but it also goes into youth washing, it goes into LGBTQI washing. And if there is something we have been seeing what is not working is if we just like publicly do some nice statements, but there are no actions. Of course, as you mentioned, Lindsay, we need to go to the actions, but I do not believe that the actions are coming from the same people who haven't yet been taking the actions, or have been taking actions, but not in the scale and the urgency we need.
A lot to digest, Marie-Claire. Thank you very much. And we have a comment echoing that from Richard Lawton, who says, I'm concerned that too many companies try to find the right words as they attempt to keep on their old path, as Matthias says about food costs. Matthias, now your rebuttal, can we at Bayer satisfy these demands? Where are we on our path?
Well, I think these are the points that are really, really important. Lindsay earlier spoke about like topics need to converge. So we now also add this whole topic of inclusion and diversity that needs to be added. I believe the sustainability transition is only possible if you transition your leadership from a very homogeneous kind of group to like a very diverse group. When you are a global company like Bayer, that geographic stretch needs to be reflected in your leadership. It's just good business to have inclusion and diversity, even without sustainability. But I believe in the sustainability space, it needs to happen. And if you want to get there fast, you need to set clear standards. I mean, Thomas, you were part of like the kind of announcements that came out at Bayer and created also some resistance that we want to have by 2025 half of all leadership positions equally filled by both genders, and that we want to make a difference on the generation side and on geography side, which are like the 3 Gs that are visible. And then Marie-Claire, of course, all the other questions. We are really in the year 2021 have a debate of the outside color of a stadium moderated by the UEFA. I mean, that should stop. Yeah, I think we are making fools out of ourselves, and the inclusion and diversity topic is a big one. Since we spoke about CSR reports or sustainability reports, for me, the best sustainability report of a company is their R&D budget. Because the sustainability report cannot replace the future a company invents. And one of the big challenges for Bayer is we have a 20 billion euro R&D budget in agriculture alone that we're going to spend in the next 9 years. Will we invest this money in climate resilience? Will we invest this money in new products that address water scarcity or not? These are, I think, the pressing questions. And almost every large company with a large R&D budget needs to answer that question, not in their report, but in their allocation of research and development, dollars, euros, yens, or whatever money you invest.
Any comments on that, Lindsay, Marie-Claire?
I have one tiny comment, Matthias. We just talked about the Pride Month, so we need to have way more than 2 genders in the boards. There are 2 mainstream genders, and Bayer just changed the logo. And I think if you change this, then also we have to talk about the diversity of gender. And I really hope that these people also find a place directly in your board. And also, as mentioned, I think gender is something we have been fighting now for very long. And I think the new fight will be about the intergenerational approach. And I really hope we are not waiting for another 20 years until I become old, that maybe my kids then are sitting in a decision-making position.
Totally agree.
Marie, we can't, huh? I mean,
as well, yeah.
Challenges, we really can't wait for another 20 years. I mean, the challenge is that no matter how you cut it, what we are discussing was the pandemic at the moment. The worst that would happen is if people in a few years wake up and say, well, I mean, why haven't we acted differently on water? And perhaps a question I have for you, Lindsay, you talked earlier about kind of how long you engaged on the topic. What's your idea to really drive this awareness that water is the topic, not a topic in the debate? So how do you think we need to approach that differently to really create a critical mass that moves the needle in advance to 2023 and then beyond? What would be your recipe?
That is a loaded question. I wish I had the best solution. Honestly, I think one of the biggest motivators for me is to connect with corporations and companies. And it's something I wish I've been doing more of, but I see kind of water and just, it's been more in this dialogue of water experts and with politicians, but I think it for sure needs to step outside of that. And we didn't really talk about habits, but bringing kind of this contextualization of water risk to the individual level, like how are individuals impacting their habits? And again, I'm going to point to kind of this youth movement for water or for climate. I think it's interesting that leap that Fridays for Future took such a leap that it pushed politicians and it started changing policies and it started making changes in corporations to focus on this. And I feel like they're definitely connected to water and climate, but there should be a growing increase of this kind of activation by young people, something that we work to do at the World Youth Parliament for Water, but it takes kind of this extra movement, if you will.
Speaking of individual contribution to safe water and climate protection, got any practical tips for us?
I do. I think when I think about practical implications, I think about it, it really needs to start with a mind shift. If I'm to think about, okay, I need to change climate, like I'm actually not very motivated for myself, because where the motivation comes from is how does my actions impact the next person. So I think on an individual level, it's really important to think of like, what's your why? Like, why are you so motivated to impact climate change? Why would you kind of change your practical solutions if, you know, using plastic bags are convenient? So think globally. And I've seen so many interesting young entrepreneurs start businesses just as a practical solution for their community. I used to live in Beirut, for example, and a young entrepreneur started a company to recycle plastic bottles and was able to find a way to make a profit off of doing so. And I love just kind of this like very local solutions. Myself, I've actually taken an interest in refurbishing furniture. So much furniture, especially with COVID, everybody wants to redecorate their houses, has just gone into the trash. But somehow I found a creative outlet of like, how can I make this piece into something practical and to be reused? So I think just finding your creative way of reusing, thinking about the process of and lifespan of a product is something to think about.
Marie-Claire, you're not only with Youngo, but also co-founder and advisor of the Sustainability Week for Business. So what's your approach to help businesses to become more sustainable?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it was already kind of leaking through a little bit that I think it's very important to really break out of the silos and the current structures. And it's exactly what we're doing. We are providing a program which is co-designed with the company to create safe spaces where, for example, also people who are normally, because of their position, not allowed to ask certain questions because then they could be questioning their position, actually can come out and say like, okay, how is this exactly about like this SDG? Why do we have these SDGs on our website? What does it actually mean for my company? And it needs to really start with this very honest discussion. And what we have been creating, especially for people in higher positions in a company, that they feel so sure about what they're doing, and also they're not really allowed to be vulnerable, right? And also really have this reflection moment on exactly like what is my as an individual, what are we as a company, and is us, like what's the vision of the whole industry. And we take way too little time to reflect on these three levels. What we're seeing, it's kind of like we're just like always moving forward and we cannot have this reflection. So what we're doing is providing and supporting companies in creating these moments to then reflect on their own strategy and ideally also change the strategy. And also always have a very intergenerational approach. So we have only young people in the team because we do believe that that the view of young people, especially the ones who are just recently graduating or who are joining you in the workforce, the Generation C, that they are very, very crucial to make this changes happen. Because then, for example, conversations can go beyond like the scope 1, 2, 3, right? I mean, Bayer has one of the hugest, or a company with a huge CO2 footprint. And of course, you can measure this all and you have the data, and then you can maybe do some insetting and you can do some offsetting. But I do not believe that this is the way you should go. Of course, this is very important and we should absolutely follow this path. But there is something more. There is something more, and I would love to see, and also if needed, support that this journey can be done, right? And this needs to be done with the employees together, because if there is just a sustainability report and just some measures about like the CO2 emissions or the impact on water, I do not think that you really harness the full potential of what you could actually do and what good you can do to the world. And not because you have to, but because you want to, because you have your intrinsic motivation to be part of this solution.
Matthias, you agree with something we should dig deeper into?
So we have had a really long conversation in the leadership, and there were lots of people involved. By the way, also like across the generations and the regions, and we came up with this vision of health for all, hunger for none. And on the one hand, it sounds like all the other visions, yeah. But the two important words that are in there is all and none. And in the midst of the pandemic, the question was, do we want to engage in something like building capacities for vaccination, even though we are not a vaccine company? And of course, then the word all drives inconvenient conversation. If you want to have health for all, you got to do something different. You can't accept that 400 million people don't have access to medicine. In the hunger for none space, it's great when you produce feed for fairly wealthy animals that then are eaten by rich people. But that's not getting you to hunger for none. And what I sense is in my company is the conversations are still not inconvenient enough. Hierarchies go against it. Also a fear that it's not safe to have those conversations. So the encouragement that we internally give is, come on, I mean, this vision is not a vision of a boardroom. So if it's a vanilla, convenient conversation, that's all the vision triggers, then it's not going to move anybody. Yeah, and this inconvenience is necessary, and speaking up is really important. That's the encouragement I internally give to people, both in my teams, but also beyond. I say, look, guys, I mean, we got to have real conversations about this. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And especially not in the time frame that both Lindsay and you, Marie-Claire, have talked about earlier today.
Yeah, and maybe sometimes it's the willingness to fail that contributes to that as well. You know, we're all always very afraid, always make sure that we do the right thing at 100%, but sometimes you have to take those risks to move forward. And then I think that's something we need to work on.
And you can't wait, huh? I mean, one of the things that we realize when we look at Bayer's internal engagement surveys, on the one hand, people say important decisions are being taken too high up in the organization. On the other hand, there is this hesitancy to just do things differently. And I think it's not only in this organization. I think it's also in many others, in governmental organizations, that people tend to not kind of really understand how much influence they have if they dare to exert their influence on a process.
So before we get too much into our own reflection time, Matthias and I
we have lots of conversations about that. We shouldn't do it here.
I would just like to take up a comment from Robert Mwaniki and Daru. Young people need mentorship and coaching. In Kenya Broadcasting, just has recalled 50 to 60-year-old legends to work together with the young. Matthias, is this something we used to have this with the senior? Oh, I don't remember. The Baizen, the seniors at Bayer, people who were retired to mentor young people. Is this something that could push the needle into one direction?
It's the other way around. So mentoring currently for the business community is that young people win lawsuits that force businesses to take care of the future. And that's the least efficient way of mentoring. So for me, it's the other way around. I also don't like the term reverse mentoring because it somehow suggests that age by definition is a qualification. It's not. Yeah. And therefore, I don't believe in position power, and I certainly don't believe that you need to have no or gray hair to be able to mentor somebody.
Cool. We have a couple of minutes left. Lindsay, Marie-Claire, it's your chance to ask Matthias any question you always wanted to know.
Matthias, I do have a question. I talked about for companies and corporations to kind of take a model for having a sustainability mind or a sustainability department, if you will. Specifically, I'm most interested in kind of water risk assessment. Does Bayer have something like that? Or what is maybe a sustainability focus point or people in your business that are working on these issues?
Yes. So in my hometown in Washington, currently, the US government tries to find a way for climate risk to be fully reflected in the way businesses talk about their future operations. Yeah? And we have done that at Bayer as well. We have actually fantastic experts. You would expect that when you have 20,000 scientists working in a company, you have like, you don't have a gap of like expertise, yeah, almost in no area. But it's really simple for Bayer. Half of our business is in agriculture. And agriculture depends like nothing else on water. So our biggest climate risk is water. I can go into 1,000 details, but water is the number one ingredient of a plant. And it's the one thing no business on earth can sell at scale. Yes, you can wrap it in plastic and have a water beverage business, but you literally can't sell rain. And the poorest farmers in the world depend on rainfall. They don't have irrigation systems. They need rainforests to produce the rain further south. And that's why rainforest is called rainforest. So for us, the biggest risk is simply that the global water cycles are so out of whack that in many places, farmers can't plant anything anymore. And though we can sell them the inputs they want, the seeds, the crop protection, or also the digital solutions. So for us, water is the climate risk, plain and unfortunately also simple.
Claire, any question to Matthias?
Yeah, maybe a follow-up to what you mentioned, Matthias, before, right? So you mentioned there is some willingness within the employees or also within the C-level management to move something forward, but then yet there is not really like the space, or people do not really know where to go or how to advance on this. And I think this is very, very crucial to also embrace what you mentioned before about these radical collaborations and the SDG 17. So are there plans already on how to make this truly happen? And also in light of the urgency and the scale we need, not only start like within like a small office, within a small team, that like really rolling this out on throughout all the departments, throughout all the offices, really make this like a core element of Bayer. So what is planned, right?
So the reason why I don't like the term sustainability strategy, it kind of suggests that that is somehow like adjacent to a business strategy. So for me, the business strategy needs to be sustainable. And oh wow, is that like my daughter, who is 12 now, came back from school and would say, oh, those are big words. Yeah, I learned big words again. But the reality is, it's very, very hard to do that because it's really difficult to make a person believe one thing. Upton Sinclair wrote that if he or she is paid for believing the opposite. That's why, apart from like vision, apart from shifting your R&D budgets, it's important that the incentives are also changing. So you need to reward what you want to see. What I like about business teams, I spent now, I want to say 15, 16 years observing amazing business leaders, is they can manage conflicting KPIs really well. They actually can do that often better than, let's say, politicians can do. But it's like juggling balls. If you don't add the balls that are linked to sustainability or social justice to the process of balancing different interests, you don't get the right results. So that's why I believe R&D budgets are really important. A culture where people don't look at position power is really important. And then the last thing that is important is, if you do the right thing, the reward mechanisms need to be linked to non-financial targets that help achieving the SDGs. Those are three, I think, really important ingredients. We dabble around with all of them. I'd be remiss to tell you that we haven't completely figured it out. It's really, really hard. I've been a politician. It's really hard for governments to get that right. Yeah, on the one hand, you want to do radical climate actions, and then you have suddenly yellow vests of people who are resisting that. How do you balance all those things really well is something we need to spend more energy on than the finger pointing between different stakeholder groups, I think.
Yeah, it's a cultural marathon, just to use another buzzword, Lindsay, but at the end, that's all what it's about. I can only echo to what Matthias just said. It's the culture, and you need to change the culture of people. And that's really is a long time effort that doesn't change overnight, but every day you need to act like it's the last day you can act on it. And that's where I'm with Marie-Claire. Matthias, let's end on this note. This has been your 8th live talk on LinkedIn so far. Today we've heard current leaders of the next generation. Your thoughts on that, on the whole experience?
One thing I really liked about the otherwise really awful pandemic is it changed the way people communicated. There were events that were closed shops, and I'm sure Lindsay and Marie-Claire, you were sometimes part of it. But somehow more people are listening in and participating and contributing. So the one thing I hope for after this event, like after other events, is that it starts new conversations that are happening often after this. So often a lot of people participate, and they participate in like different parts of the world, all kinds of time zones, and I think really are now much more inclined to engage, and that I would like to conserve even after we have provided access to vaccine for everybody around the world in the new normal post the pandemic, because I think it's really needed to solve some of those challenges.
Lindsay, Marie-Claire, was it time well spent with us?
Absolutely. I was going to say thank you to you too. I can sense from Marie-Claire and I, the openness to young people and young professionals. Like I really sense that. So thank you for that. And I also really admire kind of acknowledgement. Sometimes when you're talking to corporations and companies, they're always wanting to talk about everything that's perfect. So Matthias, to discuss openly about ways to improve. I just find that as the conversations that need to happen if we're really talking about solutions.
Well, I think as President Adler mentioned before, we really have to walk the walk, right? We really have to take the action. It was nice talking to you and nice talking to you, Lindsay, as well, and listen to the other. But with this, we haven't been saving any water body, we haven't been saving any CO2, we haven't been reducing any CO2, and haven't been contributing to any climate justice or whatever action, right? We haven't been doing radical collaboration. And that's what I'm looking forward to, working together and really making the actions needed. And I hope that this can be a start for it. And if we are going to take the actions, then I can say and look back, hopefully in some months, and say, okay, it was worth joining here this morning. And otherwise was still good to talk to you. But what we've really needed are the actions.
Thanks for that, Marie-Claire. Thank you, Lindsay. And of course, thank you, Matthias, for, which I believe, great discussion and food for thought. And of course, thanks to everyone who participated in today's live talk on LinkedIn. The great Leonardo da Vinci said that water is the driving force of all nature. Let's all keep on working this force driving. Thanks and bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was good.